Hello, everyone. We're here in Rishikesh, India, and I've been anticipating this interview for a few months now. Phil Goldberg is the author of American Veda, and this book is such a rich account of the impact of Vedic philosophy, teachings, and yoga on the Western world. And I highly recommend, Oprah, if you're watching this, highly recommend American Veda, because the impact that Vedic teachings and yoga have had on the West, I was surprised by all of it. So let's start off first, Phil. How did you come into yoga itself in meditation?
I was a child of the 60s. So when I was in college in the mid and late 60s, I was just a lost soul in many ways, but a searching soul, and I wanted answers to the important questions of life, and I wasn't getting them from conventional sources or even unconventional sources. And then the teachings of the East started to find their way into, the counterculture areas where I started to hang out. And at first it was secondhand. It was people like Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley and Joseph Campbell, and we were getting hints of the teachings from India, and of course Richard Alper, who became Ram Dass, and then it all exploded down the road here in 1968 when the Beatles came to Rishikesh to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and suddenly it was all just happening. It was happening before that, which is why it happened. But it was coming to us through the music of Ravi Shankar and the Beatles and the poetry of Allen Ginsberg and others, and novelists like J.D. Salinger, and all these people who were influenced by Eastern philosophy and were transmitting it to the rest of us. And that led some of us to the original sources. So we started reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and the writings of Buddha and all the rest. And then the gurus started to come in the aftermath, largely in the aftermath of the Beatles putting all this on the map and putting meditation on the map in a big way. And then it just grew from there. So I was part of that. And I got into transcendental meditation. I became a teacher of it. I taught it a lot in the 70s, and then certain point along the way, I became a professional writer. I started to see, as writers do, that the stuff I was interested in wasn't just me. And it wasn't just my buddies who meditated and my yoga friends and all that. It was people in the larger society. And it was happening in psychology, it was happening in healthcare, it was happening in academia, and the influence of these ideas and practices that we think of as yoga, or we think of as the philosophy of Vedanta, all that came from India, from ancient India, and was sort of translated into modern terms in recent decades, just started to permeate the culture in many ways. I saw it, and I said, someone should write this book. I proposed it in the mid-'80s. No publishers were interested. And then 20 years later, the time was right.
Well, first of all, I'm grateful that you did. I just have been so much enjoying reading. There are things I didn't even realize. Just how much Vedic teachings have permeated Western society. And just for people, who might be new to Vedic teachings, yoga, please talk about the distinction between, yoga and its relationship with Vedic teachings.
Academics can make a lot of distinctions between what is Vedic, what is Vedanta, what is Indic, what is yoga. For all practical purposes, there are certain core ideas that came to us from the deep insights of the sages of ancient India. Up further north here in the Himalayas and in the forests, they had certain insights into the nature of reality. They codified these in first oral terms and then written terms, and they came down to us. And you can make distinctions between Vedic and yogic and all that, but for all practical purposes, they have certain essence that is the same whichever route you take into it. And one is that reality is one. Ultimate reality is oneness and not just separation and difference. And that ultimate reality is divine, and it is part of our nature. And it can be realized through the methods that we think of as yoga.
Right.
And one of the important things to mention now that, this is International Yoga Day and everybody knows what yoga is, the distinction between what we currently think yoga is, which is kind of been reduced to physical practices. Because we're in a phase now where the aspect of yoga called asana, or the hatha yoga tradition, asana meaning the postures and stretches and bends, has become identified with yoga. But the larger yoga, the yoga of capital Y yoga, is a philosophy and a set of practices that includes much more than the physical practices. They also include mental and psychological and emotional and spiritual practices. And for many, many decades, the principal teachings that people in the West were drawn to weren't the physical practices of yoga, they were the meditative practices of yoga. And now the emphasis has shifted, but the rest of it never went away.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge the fact, you and I met for the first time here in Rishikesh, with Swami, here at Swamiji's ashram, Paramahansa Nikatan, and this is the birthplace of a lot of, yoga and these teachings. And it's just a profound experience to be in this birthplace, hearing what you're describing, and then also knowing some of the early influences. Could you tell us a little bit about Emerson, Thoreau, and Walt Whitman?
I was just about to say, the story of American Veda really begins in the early 19th century, when the first translations of yogic texts and the Gita and other books, first reliable interpretations started to come into America, and they got into the hands of very influential people like Emerson and Thoreau and later and Whitman. In Walden, Thoreau writes about reading the Bhagavad Gita every morning. He borrowed that book from Emerson, his mentor. And Emerson, in turn, learned about these teachings from his father, who was a Unitarian minister, who was one of the people interested in Eastern philosophy, and his aunt, a little-known influence, who kept giving him things to read. And both of them were deeply influenced by the philosophy, what you could call yogic philosophy or Vedic philosophy, or if you'd like, Hindu thought and Buddhist thought. There were no yoga studios in Concord, Massachusetts then. Right? There were no meditation centers. That was going to come, 100 years later or something. But Thoreau called himself a yogi because he recognized in the yogic texts this lofty goal of union with the cosmos, union with cosmic intelligence and the energy that we think of as God or the divine. And he said, I'm a yogi. He probably would never have stretched or bent in a yoga posture in his life. Right. And there are people today who live the spirit of yoga because they meditate every day, they go deep within, they aspire to union with the divine, they recognize that there are many pathways to the divine, and they don't have a yoga mat.
Right. What I thought was interesting when you were writing about Emerson and Thoreau is like, there they were out in nature, having experiences of union, and then reading the Gita and like, aha, this helps me understand.
This is what I've been experiencing.
What I've been experiencing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Say more about that.
Well, and that kind of thing is not uncommon. We all have this nature, this divine nature at the core of our being, and sometimes we access it spontaneously. And people have had these sudden illuminations. And in the drug days, in the 60s, when people were taking psychedelics, and of course still today, and especially then, people will be having these transcendent experiences. Their consciousness suddenly shifted into oneness, and everything being love and everything being intelligence. And they said, what is going on here? The answer to that question, what is going on here, often led them to India, or to at least the yogic book. That's what led Richard Alpert to India, and he ended up becoming Ram Dass. And that was repeated many times. And one of the reasons for it is because you can also find it in the mystical literature of all the religions. But you have to look for the mystical and the esoteric literature, because it's not in the everyday. In India, they kept it alive. The yogis, the swamis, the rishis, they kept the core knowledge of what these teachings are and the models of consciousness and development that are part of the yogic tradition. It was kept alive, and it's very clear and very rational. It's not religious in the sense of having to believe in something or that only certain people have access to this. They're presented as a kind of universal teachings, and almost like a psychology of consciousness.
Well, as science.
As science. There's this understanding, and you can have the experience to verify it. And you don't have to believe it, but here are these methods, and if you have certain experiences, then you'll see that these teachings are true. And that was very appealing to Americans.
Yeah, and what I thought was interesting is how this created a revolution through Emerson and Thoreau. You know, just that suddenly you can have your own direct relationship with the divine. And that was radical.
I think of Emerson as the founding father of spiritual but not religious. He was like he gave an address at Harvard Divinity School that became very famous. And some people called it our spiritual declaration of independence, where he was saying essentially to future clergy, give people the direct experience of God. You don't need to believe in everything, it's just, that's what matters. And in a sense, all of his writings flow from that, and Thoreau's as well. And so that ethos sort of permeated American literature and American philosophy, and then it took other people who were exposed to the gurus like Swami Vivekananda, who was the first to come in 1893, and his successors in the Vedanta Society, and then Paramahansa Yogananda, who came in 1920 and was the most famous and best known guru of the early part of the first half of the 20th century. And then people like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who popularized meditation, and Swami Vivekananda, and A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, and all the rest who came in the 60s and 70s, they reached people who in turn had influence. And that's one of the interesting things. That's why one of the reasons people like you don't always know how much these teachings have permeated the culture, because some of it is very subtle. These gurus came, the books came, the teachings came, and then they affected certain people who absorbed the teachings, adapted them to their discipline and their area of expertise, and transmitted them to others. And in many cases, they were very famous people. They wrote novels like J.D. Salinger did, and they reached people on national television like Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith did, and the teachings spread in that manner. They spread through clerics like Thomas Merton and Western religious figures who were influenced by Eastern teachings, psychologists and physicists, scientific researchers who legitimized the effects of meditative practices and yogic practices. So through all these different tributaries and streams, these teachings sort of filtered into the culture to where, in some cases, we don't even know where they came from.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how you say Walt Whitman's poetry, he didn't read the Gita, but he was inspired by Thoreau and Emerson.
Right.
And you described him as a bhakti yogi.
Yeah, I think of him as, of the three of them, I think of him as the bhakti and the tantrika. He was celebrating the divine in everything. Song of Myself is thought, some people think, oh, it's narcissism. No, he was saying, God is in me and in myself, and myself is in everything. This is pure tantric teaching, you know. So
yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, it just goes on and on, like, I mean, the Unity Church you were talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, on and on. Different people who are now, it's just so mainstream.
yeah, and now everybody practices yoga. And now if you take a survey, and one of the things I did with American Veda is look at the surveys of Americans' attitudes toward religion and spirituality since the 60s, essentially. And you see a steady growth in the clear direction toward more and more yogic influence. So more and more people now would say all the different paths to the divine are legitimate.
Which is a yogic philosophy.
Which is pure yoga. You know, there's pure, you know, the Vedas, one of the most famous expressions in the Vedas is usually translated as truth is one, and the wise call it by many names. And that people like Sri Ramakrishna extended that as the world became more diverse and the different religions came to be experienced in India, to include Christianity and Islam and all the others, that if you take any path deep enough, you will come to the same realization that all is one. And most people will now accept that that's true in America. Most people's attitudes toward other religions are much more accepting and pluralistic than they used to be. The other thing is most people will now say what's important about their spiritual life is their inner experience of the divine, as opposed to what organization you belong to and what you believe in.
Right. You know, Phil, we could go so much into this. I mean, I just hope people are really appreciating the fact that these ancient teachings, this science has been permeating Western culture, you know, since the 1900s. And it's interesting because, you know, Yogananda, you know, talks about yoga coming to the West when there's quantum physics was starting to come out. Sri Yukteswar would say Dwapara Yuga, a time of, you know, just scientific discoveries where we would have a language to understand this ancient science.
In universal ways, so it can be expressed to anybody, anywhere, without people getting sectarian about it.
Right.
I always say we're becoming a nation of yogis, and in that we are recognizing and seeking the unity that we are in our essence, and it's not just the union of the head to the knee. Right. It's the union of the individual and the cosmic.
Okay, I want to move this along because there's so much here. The other thing I thought was interesting is how then these teachings then go back to India. I thought the one example that was really interesting is about Mahatma Gandhi was encouraged to read the Gita by people from the West who were inspired. Tell us that.
Yeah.
The back
First, you have to recognize that Henry David Thoreau was deeply influenced by the Bhagavad Gita. Then you have to realize that Gandhi was deeply influenced by Henry David Thoreau when he became a spiritual activist. He discovered the Gita not in India, but in London when he was being a lawyer and a very secular guy. So both Thoreau and Gandhi were influenced by the Gita. And when Gandhi's activism kicked in, he was influenced by Thoreau's essays on civil disobedience. And then in turn, Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists were, of course, influenced by Gandhi.
Right. And this is the thing I think is so powerful. I mean, these are major figures in our lifetime. And is that these ancient teachings inspired karma yoga action for the larger whole, because we're aware of our connectedness with the larger whole. Can you expand on
karma yoga?
No. Just the fact. I mean, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Thoreau. Thoreau was an activist.
And people think of them in purely political terms.
Right.
Gandhi as the father of Indian independence, and Martin Luther King as the father of the civil rights movement. But there was deep spiritual underpinnings to their work and a deep sense of we're all in this together and we are doing the work of the divine in action, and it was selfless service of the highest order. And they understood that, and they recognized that. And karma yoga is essentially selfless service. They were doing it in the service of freedom for people and liberation of countries and large groups of humanity. But the ethic of it has gone further, so people just doing service work in their local communities and all that. It's not that this was absent from Western religion. It was always a service orientation, but I think the people you're mentioning have affected people have influenced people to engage in spiritual activism in a different kind of way somehow.
Yeah, ahimsa.
In the service of nonviolence and using nonviolence as not just a principle of action, but as a tool of action.
Right. And I mean, let's just for folks who might be new, I mean, just the basics of yama and niyama, just the basic. We're going to need to wrap up here, but just to let folks know, I mean, some of these basic tenets.
People often think of yoga and meditation as just pure practices for self-improvement, but there's a strong ethical and moral content behind it as well. And if people can go to a yoga class and just feel better and have better health and all that, and that's fine. But those who go deeper into it will discover that there's an inner liberation that comes that transcends just physical health and physical well-being, and it will affect not just consciousness, but also the heart and the soul. So people start to become better people.
Right. And what I think is powerful, we were talking with Anand Mehrotra earlier, and in the film Awake the Life of Yogananda, it's just like when Yogananda's writing the autobiography of a yogi, we were dropping the first atomic bomb. The need for the teachings, I think this might have been your line in the movie, Awake the Life of Yogananda, was the teachings is more urgent, more important today.
And a lot of people did. And you could say that a lot of what happened in the 60s and this searching that led people to these core teachings of India and opened the floodgates for gurus to come here was the madness of Vietnam and the civil, segregation and everything else. The world seemed like a terribly awful and threatening place. And people were saying, well, what's going on here? Where do I find some truth? Where do I find meaning and love and understand? I hate to get 60s cliche on us, but that was a big part of the search. It was desperate times, and people opened up to what might have otherwise not reached them in a deep way. And I think that opened the floodgates.
And then to be able to have our own direct personal experience.
Yes, and that's the critical issue here. The critical issue is the yogic teachings, the meditative practices, the hatha yoga practices. They are internal practices that open us up to the experience of yoga. You do yoga to experience yoga with a capital Y. Right. You do the practices of yoga to experience the state of consciousness that is yoga, the union of the individual and the universe.
Yeah, I love the expression I've heard here in Rishikesh. You do yoga and yoga does you. It's like it transforms.
It transforms you. And that's the critical issue here. These teachings caught on because they changed people's lives. If they didn't, if they were just good ideas, it would have reached a few people.
And what's exciting now is, International Day of Yoga. Yoga is being practiced in every country in the world. And
even India.
And even India, which it creates it creates the possibility of creating a world we can't even imagine. More and more people tapping into this universal wisdom.
Right. And applying it in ways that are relevant to them in their lives and their culture.
And service, whether it's to the environment, social justice, hunger, whatever it is.
Yeah, or just having a better family life or anything.
Right. Well, we're going to need to wrap up. I keep thinking about the Beatles just down the road here.
I know, it's great. Literally down the road.
And we listened to a kirtan practice. A young kirtan group was performing there at the ashram. Any closing comments for people who are watching around the world? And
these teachings that we call yoga are really just universal truths that can be accessed through the methods that have come down to us, and there are many, many methods. And all I can say is take it as deeply as you're able to at whatever stage of life you are on. But always remember, there's more to it, and avail yourself of it, because it's a fantastic opportunity to not just be healthier and not just look better and not just feel better, but to have a transformation of consciousness.
yeah, beautiful. Well, Phil, I just want to say it's a real delight just to meet you in
My
person
pleasure.
and here in Rishikesh. And I hope everyone is as inspired as I am. I seldom do this, but American Veda is an exceptional read to really more fully understand the impact of Vedic teachings and yoga in transforming the world that we live in.